And we are live. Here we are again for the Young Christians Survival Guide. And I wanted to start off with just a little bit of a story before I turn over to Don and let him wax eloquently, as he often does. Some years ago, I was teaching at a junior college uh, on Religion 101, and the professor had asked me to come in to do a session on Christianity. And so I did, and as I was getting done, I asked for questions, and one of the students, college students who like know everything, raised his hand and asked me the big stumper question of, well, you can't really trust the Bible. It's been translated over and over so many times, and there's so many errors in it and contradictions. And I said, I'm really glad you raised that. That's a great question and a great point. And I had my big floppy Bible in hand, and I passed it on to him. And I said, I appreciate if you could show me just a few of the contradictions that you've come across. And he stops and he looked at me and said, well, I've never read the Bible. I said, well, how then would you know that there's mistakes and contradictions? And he said, well, I heard there are. And I said, good. Well, where did you hear that from? And he said, well, I don't really remember. So I said, so doesn't this concern you a little bit that you are certain there's mistakes and errors and contradictions? You got that from a source that you don't know, you can't remember, and you're unsure then if they are actually true and verified. And he said, well, it's been translated over and over. And I said, okay, there's another one. How would you know that? And so we got into a discussion then on what we're going to talk about tonight, textual criticism. There's this idea floating around out there that there was an original document that was translated by somebody else into another language and then was translated by somebody else later into another language and so forth until we get our Bible today. None of that is true. So, with that, we're going to talk with Don Williams again, our guide at the Fellowship of the Book.
Yes.
And we're going to be talking exactly about how do we know that the documents that we have today are substantially like what not substantially are substantially what was originally written.
Yeah,
So
there's a new kind of skeptic I run into these days. They know a little bit about the facts of the history of the text of the New Testament, nothing about the process of how those texts are studied to give us the Bible that we have in our hands.
right.
So, if we could get the screen share up, uh, we will take a look at that issue. Uh, there are tons of manuscripts. There are more manuscripts of the New Testament than any other ancient book. Uh, in fact, there's some 5,000 of them. I think we can get the actual number on the screen if we try hard enough.
Oh, there we are.
There we go. 5,836 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. That was copied a lot. It was copied a lot. Now, if you imagine yourself copying the New Testament by hand, let's say you do it very carefully. How many typos wouldn't be typos? They'd be fingeros, I suppose, or penos that you would put in this thing in the course of copying it. You think you would? You think you could copy the New Testament 5,836 times perfectly without making any mistakes? Not
No,
hearing a lot of response.
no.
No.
I can barely type without making mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I make more mistakes typing than I do handwriting, but either way,
Yeah.
when you're 5,836 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament or parts of it that have survived and are in our possession. There were lots more, of course, that were made. And naturally, there were mistakes made in copying. As a matter of fact, we even have somebody has even counted the number of discrepancies, which is the next figure. 400,000 variant readings. A variant reading is where in any two of these manuscripts, there's something different. It could be a different spelling of a word. It could be a word that's replaced with another word. It could be a word that's missing. It could be any number of different things. Now, if you don't know how this works and you just look at those numbers, you're thinking, 400,000 variant readings. The conclusion that people reach is, well, there's so many mistakes. We don't even know what the original manuscript said. So why do you Christians are so intent on basing everything on this book, claiming it's in there? And we don't even know what it said, for goodness sake. Just 400,000 mistakes in the copies. Well, next bit will show us that almost all of them are trivial. Here's an example of the kind of thing that happens. In Luke 12:1, Jesus is talking about the teaching of the Pharisees, and he uses a metaphor like he often does. And he says, the leaven, that is the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. That's what some of the manuscripts read. And some of them say, the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. That's just the English translation of the two different alternatives in the Greek. Well, whichever one of those was the original, it means exactly the same thing. Okay? Either one of these was the original and somebody wasn't paying attention and changed it to the other, and then that got copied and created a different reading. But the point is, the difference is trivial. In fact, and we're going to talk about how we know this, 95+% of the time, there is no question what the original was. If there is a question, the bottom line is it usually doesn't matter. There's only a very small handful of passages where it matters at all. So, there are a lot of ancient documents where only one manuscript or a handful, 4 or 5 manuscripts have survived, and nobody questions that we know what the author said. But somehow in the Bible it's different. So almost all of them are trivial, and when they do make a difference, we have a way of dealing with it. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to spend most of our time not talking about is, if we can move on to the next slide, the criteria that textual scholars use, textual critics use to evaluate the variants, to try to determine which is the correct one. So there are a number of criteria that we use. The first one is number of manuscripts. How many manuscripts say A as opposed to the ones that say B? And a lot of people think this is a big deal, but actually this is the least important criterion.
Can I ask a question while you're talking about the number of manuscripts?
Pardon?
While you're talking about the number of manuscripts, could I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
What is family of manuscripts? I don't think we covered that, but it probably would be helpful to those who are watching because
when there's a group of manuscripts that have similar readings and maybe come from a particular geographical region, those are called a family of manuscripts. Okay, so it's not just random differences scattered over the 5,000 manuscripts. They actually come in groups. That is, a manuscript, if it has mistakes, will tend to have the same ones. Or if it has variants, will tend to have the same ones. So they group together in families that way. But the first criterion that you could go by to try to determine what the correct reading is, which one has the most manuscripts that say that. Much more important is the age of the manuscript. The older the manuscript is, the closer it is to the original. So those manuscripts have a higher claim over the ones that come later. But you can't use any of these criteria just by itself. They all have to be taken into account because, as we'll see later, just because a manuscript's older doesn't necessarily make it better. Third, the geographical distribution of readings. So if you have, let's say that first reading of the verse in Luke that we looked at only shows up in manuscripts that are around the city of Philippi. And the other one shows up in manuscripts from all over the Roman Empire. That makes a difference. If the first situation happens, and that probably means that somebody made a mistake in Philippi, and that got copied in the manuscripts that were copied from that one, and there they are in Philippi, but the one that is all over the whole empire probably represents the original. The next criterion is that there are particular types of errors that scribes tend to make. And they have fancy names. We'll break this all down and talk about what those are. But if you know the kind of mistakes that scribes make, then when you're comparing two different readings, sometimes you can tell, I can see how the second reading came about, because that's the typical type of mistake. That's a piece of evidence that points you toward the correct reading. And then finally, there are some more sophisticated criteria, such as the principle of lectio brevio potior and lectio difficilior potior. These are Latin phrases. What they mean is, they're Latin phrases because scholars always use Latin phrases because it makes them sound smart and impressive.
And keeps us guessing.
All things being equal, the shorter reading is more likely to be correct, and the more difficult reading is more likely to be correct. So that's just a list of 6 criteria that we use to evaluate the variance. And when you put them all together and find a lot of them pointing in the same direction, or if one of them doesn't, there's an obvious reason why, then you have very, very high confidence that you've got the correct reading. Basically, 98, 99%, we know what the original said, and there's no question about it. So we're going to take these criteria now and break them down in more detail. First, number of manuscripts. The number of manuscripts, some people are really impressed by that, but it's actually the least important factor that we have to deal with. Why is that? Well, let's imagine that we've got 2 manuscripts. We can get back to there we go. It's the least important. Let's imagine that we've got a couple of manuscripts. We've got 2 copies of the New Testament that were bought in Ephesus in AD 100. Okay, most of them were written like from the 50s through the 80s, and so AD 100, 2 copies are bought, and you buy these 2 copies, and you notice that in one verse there's a different wording, reading A and reading B, like the example we showed you earlier. Okay, so what happens to these 2 manuscripts moving ahead? Let's say one of them is taken to Toccoa, Georgia, and there's not a lot of people there. There's not a big book market there. It's a country town. It's a little town. 3 copies of that one get made. The other one is taken to Athens, Georgia, where there's a big university and lots of readers and lots of demand for books and lots of bookstores. That one gets copied 500 times. So reading A has 3 witnesses. Reading B has 500 But does reading B really have 500 witnesses? No, it only has one, because all those 500 are just repeating what the one manuscript said that they were copied from. Whereas reading A, it only has 3, but they're all copies of 1. So it's not 500 to 3, it's actually 1 to 1. So you can't just go by the number of manuscripts. And this is why the King James only people really don't have a leg to stand on. They do not understand the way textual criticism works. They say we have the majority text. More manuscripts give these readings in anything, and that just shows they don't understand how this works, because you can't just count the number, because you don't know what the numbers mean. 500 versus 3 might just be 1 against 1. If I tell y'all a secret, the secret is that the University of Georgia will three-peat in the national championship. You heard it first here. And people are discussing who's going to win, and all of y'all say it's going to be Georgia. There's only really one witness, not a bunch. Okay? So, yeah, you take number of manuscripts into account, but unless you know more than just the raw numbers, it doesn't really tell you that much. You got to know the history behind the manuscripts. So the King James only view really fails. It doesn't understand the way this works. All right. So if you can't just go by number of manuscripts, then what do? The age of the manuscript is more important. All things being equal, older is better, because generally the older the manuscript is, probably the closer it is to the original, but not necessarily. Again, let's imagine a couple of manuscripts. The first one, manuscript A, is copied in 400 AD, and it happens to be 3 copies removed from the original. The autograph means the original, the actual manuscript that John or Matthew or Mark or Luke or Paul or James wrote. That's the autograph. And it gets copied, and the copy gets copied, and manuscript A is 400 AD, 3 copies removed from the autograph. Manuscript B was made in 300 AD, but it's 10 copies removed. Okay? So B is older, but it's not better. A is better than B, because what matters is not just the age, it's how many copies is it removed? How many steps is it removed from the original? Jeff, you got a question?
I do. I just have to ask this. It might be difficult, but maybe not. So we're talking about almost 6,000 different manuscripts, 5,800, whatever. And we're representing...
Just to clear something, manuscripts and portions of manuscripts.
That's just the Greek ones.
Right.
We also have manuscripts of where it was copied into other languages, and those are also used because the translation can be evidence for what the text was that it was translated from. So I'm trying to keep it relatively simple. But okay, we got almost 6,000.
Okay. All right. So then I want to ask the question. It sounds like we have a lot of data on these manuscripts. Do we really have data that how many times they've been copied, where the location they came from? You've seen that, and that's incredible. That's true, right? What you're representing.
Well, now, it's not like we know the complete history of every one of them. In other words, these 2 hypothetical manuscripts that I just put on the screen, to show it's possible for a manuscript that is actually not as old to be closer to the original, depending on how we got these two manuscripts, and maybe we know the date, but we don't know how many copies removed each one is. Okay. So sometimes we do, sometimes we know the specific history, but often we don't. And so that what I'm trying to explain is you can't take any one of these criteria and go by that one and say, okay, we're just going to take the oldest manuscript that we got and go with that. Well, you want to know what the oldest manuscript says, because all things being equal, in general, older is better. But just because it's older doesn't necessarily mean it's correct.
Yeah, I get you're teaching these concepts. What I'm really impressed with is that we really have these manuscripts. I mean, I never knew that. It's amazing.
Not only do we have them, but we have digitalized them and put them online, and you can go look at them.
Oh my gosh.
So contrast.
In addition, so there's the manuscripts. In addition, we have quotes by the early church fathers in their writings.
Right.
We have early what's called lectionaries with quotes. So if we compare all this material together, we really do know what was originally written.
Yeah, it's way more than 6,000, because if Clement of Rome in the year AD 100 writes a letter and quotes the New Testament, then that quotation is evidence for what those verses said.
Right.
And then lectionaries, they would have liturgies that they made where there's a lot of quotations from Scripture in the liturgy. And those are evidence for what the manuscript said, or what the church understood it to say, and accepted it as saying. So the amount of data we have is truly astonishing. And think about the difference now between the Bible and the Quran. At a certain point, the Caliph chose one copy of the Quran and said, this is the official Quran. Every other copy was burned. And then it's all made from that one. You can't investigate the correct reading of the Quran. You have to take their word for it.
Right.
But the Christians say, hey, here's the data. We're putting it online. We've digitalized it. You can go online and look at these manuscripts for yourself if you want to. And now, if you look at the approach of those two groups, I would suggest one of them is the approach of somebody who doesn't have anything to hide and probably has the truth, and the other one is the approach of somebody who's got a lot to hide and is hiding it, has hidden it. It's burned. It's gone.
So maybe we can
investigate it.
Maybe we can put that link, because this is on YouTube also. We can put that link below. I've seen them do that. I'd like to go look at those. I'd love to see that.
Well, there's not a link.
Yep.
Okay. But they are all available, and scholars who can read Greek can go look at any of them they want. Yeah.
Nice.
So, number of manuscripts, it matters, but not really that much. The age of the manuscript matters. And then we get to the third criterion, which is the geographical distribution of the manuscripts. So this is a big thing. This is more important still. So let's imagine we have one reading that, like I said before, it's limited to one area. Reading A is only in manuscripts from Philippi. Reading B shows up all over the Roman Empire. In all probability, I mean, you're trying to explain this data. Probably reading A reproduces a mistake that was made in Philippi That's why those are different from everything else. Reading B is more likely to represent the original because everything goes back to that, whereas if you're tracing it back, the line in Philippi stops. It doesn't go all the way back. That's why it's different. Now, this gets complicated because you don't always have the ideal scenario like I just laid out. Sometimes things appear in more of one reading appears in more of the empire than another one does. It's not always neatly either universal or local, but that's one of the things you look for. The more widely distributed geographically a reading is, the more likely it goes all the way back to the original. Whereas something that shows up in one family or one tradition, one area, the most logical explanation for why that happened is somebody made a scribal error, tiny little mistake in that area, and then they got reproduced and repeated from the things that were copied from that manuscript. And
can I interrupt for a second?
Go ahead.
Because I sometimes have to do sort of a hands-on thing. So let's say Don wrote a document and then gave it to me. And I copied it and gave a copy to Jeff. And in the process of copying it, I changed one word or one letter from one word. And Jeff then makes a copy of that and passes it on to somebody else exactly as I wrote it and so forth. Now, he's in my area, so that's the Wonder Lake area. One mistake is made, and then it's passed on to however many that goes. The second one is I make a copy and send it to our Colorado crew, and Morgan diligently copies what I wrote, but I made a different mistake in that one, and she then passes it off to others in the Colorado area. So we have Don's original, my two copies, each one has a slightly different error, and they're both then going out from different locations, one from Wonder Lake and one from Colorado. And that's how you can kind of tell where things came from in terms of errors, right, and which family of text they are. Does that make sense?
Clear as mud.
Okay, good. Clear as mud. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is there are typical scribal errors, and there are a lot of them. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. One of them is haplography, which means written only once. A word appears twice, but the scribe skips to the second one. So this is actually not a biblical text. It's something I just made up to illustrate how this could happen. Let's say we're reading along and it says, then Paul arrived in the city of Corinth. Antipholus said, welcome to Corinth. We must preach the gospel here, said Paul. And now I'm copying this. And so what happens is I look down and I write, thus Paul arrived in the city of Corinth. And then I look over to my copy and I'm writing there. And I look back to the original and I see the second word Corinth. And I think it's the first one. So as a result, the second sentence gets skipped. And the result is we must preach, then Paul arrived in the city of Corinth. We must preach the gospel here, said Paul. And the line about Antipholus welcoming him to Corinth disappears because when I looked back to the original, I saw the word Corinth, and I thought it was the word I just wrote. And I went on from there. So this is a very typical, obvious, natural, normal thing that will happen when you're copying a lot of words by hand, called haplography. A word gets written only once. And then the opposite of that is ditography, which means written twice. So let's start with the same scenario. Then Paul arrived in the city of Corinth, and Antipholus said, welcome to Corinth. Okay, now, when I look back from my copy to the original, I forget that I've already written the word Corinth and I write it again. Then Paul arrived in the city of Corinth. Corinth, of all places. Antipholus said. So the word that's only supposed to be there once ends up being there twice because of an obvious natural mistake. Now, these are two examples. There's lots of other ones that experts in this field go by. And so when you're examining two possible readings, one of the things you do is look and say, okay, does one of these readings explain the other one? In other words, can I see how the second reading got created by the scribe? You know, it's late. He's getting tired.
He hasn't had his coffee.
And yeah, he's out of coffee, or you know, coffee in Brazil hadn't been discovered yet, or whatever, and it just happens. Okay, so
and does either rendering change the meaning of the text?
That's the question.
Not really. The first one you lose a little bit. The second one, they change it a little bit, but
Not sufficient.
Not in such a way that you would get a wrong doctrine out of either passage.
Right.
No doctrine of Scripture, not a single one, depends on which variant in a given passage that has one is original. All the doctrines of Scripture are in it so consistently in many passages, and none of the errors that are errors, even if you thought the error was the real original text, it doesn't affect a single doctrine. Jeff?
Yeah, so I just wanted to read. I mean, now you've already said it, but here's what you said in your book.
Mm-hmm.
When combined with the wealth of information we have about the manuscripts of the New Testament, they give us pretty much 99% certainty about the original wording, and almost all the discrepancies that remain are trivial, with no effect on the meaning of the passages in question, and no impact at all on the doctrines being taught by them. That's good.
Exactly.
Now, not all of them are trivial, but none of them changes a single doctrine.
Right.
That's the important thing to realize.
Right.
Okay? More sophisticated criteria. The shorter reading, all things being equal, is more likely to be correct. The shorter reading is to be preferred. Always add all things being equal, because like I keep emphasizing, none of these by itself can decide anything. You have to take all of it into account, weigh the totality of the evidence, and then you come to a conclusion. But scribes tended to err on the side of fullness. We know this about their historical practice, especially the scribes who were copying Scripture, because Scripture is inspired by God. Consequently, they were very afraid that they didn't want to lose any of it. They should have been equally afraid not to add anything to it, I suppose. But in fact, they didn't want to lose anything. And so if you had, after this had been going on a while, a scribe might have been aware of two different readings. And to make sure he got the right one, he would put them both in. Or a scribe, you've got these handwritten manuscripts. They're not printed books.
Right.
And so somebody makes a marginal notation. It's like, if you look at any of my personal books in my personal library, you'll see that I've got them highlighted, underlined. I've got comments, notes in the margin, sometimes a running argument with the author in the margin. Well, suppose somebody wrote something in the margin that you couldn't quite tell. What was it part of the text that the original scribe forgot to put in, so he stuck it on the side there. So they would stick that in. So maybe you're copying one of the Gospels, and the parallel passage from another Gospel adds a few words that that particular Gospel writer left out, and they're in your mind because you've read the Scripture so much, you've got it practically memorized, and so without even realizing it, you put them in here and add them. So there are a lot of readings a lot of variants that came into existence through that process, and sometimes we actually know that that's what happened. The other criterion is that the more difficult reading is to be preferred. Why is that the case? Well, because scribe is reading along, and he knows that he's got a copy. He knows he doesn't have the absolute original, and so he reads something he doesn't understand, and he thinks the apostle couldn't have written that, so he smooths it out a little bit, fixes the grammar, or what he thinks is fixing the grammar, or makes it clearer. And so the more difficult reading, all things being equal, tends to be more the original, because you're not trying to create difficulties, you're trying to get rid of them. And so we've got all these criteria. Now, the way this works is that you don't go by any one of them. You can't get on one of them as a hobby horse and say, okay, I'm going to go with the majority text, or, oh, this is the oldest manuscript. You have to take all of it into account. So you've got the data, got a tremendous amount of data. I could show you, let's see if I can find a good page. Here we go. Yeah. Take a look at this page, if you can see it, from my Greek New Testament. And the actual text is here. You can't get this thing focused well.
Okay.
Right here, see that little gap? Everything below that is information about the manuscripts. It gives in a verse where there is any discussion at all about what the original said. It gives you the different readings and then lists the manuscripts and the manuscript families that go with it. So the footnotes on that page are twice as much space on the page, and they're actually more than twice, because the print's a lot smaller. So it's actually 4 times as much information about manuscripts as there is the actual text at the top of the page. That shows you how much information we have, and of course they've already distilled it down to what the editors think are the most important bits of information for what you see in the footnotes under the verses. And you take everything into account. What has the most manuscripts, what the different families are, which are the regional things, and everything we know about the nature of the scribal enterprise and the way scribes operated. And what you're trying to do is to create a family tree. If we can go back to the slide again. We're trying to create an explanation. We weigh all the factors and we're trying to explain, okay, if one of these readings is the original, one's the mistake. If this is a mistake, how did it get here? Okay. So we try to reconstruct the family tree that lets us trace both back to the original and see how the second reading came into existence. What is the reading that best explains the variance? In other words, if reading A is true, I can see how reading B and C could have come about later. And the manuscripts and the age of the manuscripts and the kind of manuscripts and the geographical distribution of the manuscripts supports that. And so if you're skilled at doing this, and there are people who are very skilled at it, anyone who's a professional in this field will tell you that, yes, in the great majority of cases, absolute confidence in the text is justified. We're not really in doubt about what the New Testament said. Now, there are a small number of verses where we're not absolutely sure which is the correct reading, which was the original. But when that happens, it really doesn't affect the meaning. It never affects the doctrine that's being taught. And so I think what I would say is, for all practical purposes, we have the original New Testament. For all practical purposes, we have it. And if you want an excuse, then you've got to get that tiny little sliver of question that remains and try to use that to overturn everything. I tried to express this in a sonnet. This poem was inspired by an argument I had with a skeptic on Facebook one time, who just refused to deal with, I tried to explain to him how textual criticism works, and he would just go back to 400,000 variants. 400,000 variants. That settled it for him. He has no clue what they are, or what they mean, or what the process is by which we go about resolving them. So let's go back to that poem, because I don't have it memorized, and I think it really sums up the situation pretty well. The skeptic doubts there even is a text. He hides behind the tiny variations and will not hear a reasonable narration of methods, what comes first and what comes next, criteria to leave us unperplexed. His questions answered bring him no elation. He must not really want illumination. The truth he claims to seek just leaves him vexed. The seeker of the truth will not be whipped so easily. He turns from what is not to the rich wine waiting to be sipped. So revels in the pleasure of the plot, the romance of the ancient manuscript, the treasure of the tittle and the jot. So in the octave and the sextet, you have the contrast. I would rather live on the right side of that screen with the 6 lines that come after the break. So, any questions? We've got a few minutes for questions this week.
I was going to ask if that, I think, I don't know if that's part of how the criteria goes as well, where because of the many different copies, that you can make the comparisons and actually find out how to correct those supposed variants, in a sense, because people can, the translators were able to get the exact, the actual wording.
The number of copies is certainly helpful.
Right.
I mean, it increases the difficulty of simply the amount of labor that has to be done to work through them all, but it's a wealth of data.
Right.
Okay. And the nature of the variants, they're little mistakes like you would make if you were copying it. And in most cases, we can understand how they came about, where they came from. And so, yeah, it's difficult. It intuitively looks difficult because there's so much data.
Right.
But it's good that we have that much data because it lets us really parse this thing down to the jots and the tittles. And
Right. By the way, Donna says, truth, the treasure of the tittle and the jot. I love it.
Their poem was
treasure of
great.
the tittle of the jot. Yeah.
Yes.
There's something else I'd like to raise, which helps this whole discussion on textual criticism, and it comes up in the Gospel of Mark. Now, as Don has pointed out, and we've talked about, just because there's a word difference or a letter difference doesn't mean we don't know what it actually meant.
Right.
What if we have a whole section? Don was talking about making notations and how they may have crept into the text, which probably happened. And so there's discussion going on about the last few verses in the Gospel of Mark. Were they in the original? Were they added or not? And liberals especially like to say, no, they weren't in the original, they were added. Now, why is that important? Because guess where the resurrection account occurs in Mark? It's in those verses. And so the thinking then is this: if they were added, and Mark was the earliest of the Gospels written, probably was. Some think it's Matthew, some think it's Mark, but let's say it's Mark. Was that added in order to make Mark echo the idea of the resurrection? In other words, he didn't really believe in it. So here's how I handle that, because the answer is actually in the Gospel of Mark. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago, and I think Don would agree with this, is you never build doctrine from a single passage of Scripture.
Right.
It needs to be supported elsewhere. Or you could get in trouble. I think this is the same thing on this claim here. Just because this section may not have been in the original, I'm not saying if it was or it wasn't. If it wasn't, does that invalidate the teaching of the resurrection? Well, we can actually find out from Mark himself. So here's the question, guys. Was Mark written before or after the supposed resurrection event?
Would have been after the resurrection.
Yeah.
Nobody questions that.
Right. Did Mark believe Jesus was a true prophet or a false prophet when he wrote it?
True.
A true prophet. So he would have believed that a true prophet, what he spoke as a true prophet, would be true. What he believed, what he was predicting would happen. Okay, good. Let's go with that for a second. What we find out is if we go back to Mark 8:31, and you might want to write these down. Mark 8:31, we read this interesting passage. And he, and that's talking of Jesus, began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. What's Mark saying would be predicted by the prophet whom he believed?
The ending of Mark is the most difficult problem in textual criticism.
That's the
a short ending, there is a long ending, and manuscripts have one or the other, or some have both, and the ones that have both have them in different orders. But here's something that we need to realize, and that is there is a resurrection story. The resurrection story is before that happens. In Mark 16, verses 1 through 8, there's nobody questions. That's part of Mark. And that's where the ladies go to the tomb and they see the angel who tells them that Jesus is risen. Now, the appearances of Jesus are in those other endings. Okay.
That's true.
But to say that there's no resurrection in Mark because of the textual problems is simply wrong, because Mark has the first half of the resurrection story. He has an empty tomb. He has angels, for goodness sake, telling you that Jesus is risen from the dead. Even if everything else was added later to make it fill out like the other Gospels, you still can't say there's no resurrection. You've got the
Well, you
prophet,
can't. And he predicted.
and you've got the angels.
And he
There's no problem with the angels. Go ahead.
Well, he predicts it 7 times before we get to Mark 16 at all.
So
you have an account written by someone who believed that Jesus was at least a prophet, predicting his resurrection, and it was written after the resurrection would have occurred.
And even if we throw out, which we don't, even if we threw out both endings, you still have Mark ending with the resurrection.
Right.
It's tomb is empty.
Doesn't really
angels are telling you that the prophecies have been fulfilled. I would think that if Mark says that an angel said this, he probably believes it's true.
So I got a point to make. It seems like we still have a lot of people out there claiming that there isn't any evidence, it's been made up and all this. Well, you've shown me evidence that it's very clear. So
people
if
who
they
say
continue
there's no evidence are simply confessing their ignorance, or they're lying. One of the two. They're either ignorant, they're either too ignorant to be discussing this, or they're flat out lying. Right. Now, you can say, I don't think there's enough evidence. You can say, I don't find the evidence convincing. You can say, I think there's counter evidence, and we can discuss that. But if somebody tells you there's no evidence, there's only 2 possibilities. They're either lying or they're just plain ignorant.
Right.
And I've caught them. I've caught people doing both of those things.
So my point is, after somebody watches this, it would make good sense if they would read the New Testament, because it's evident that it was the original. So I would encourage anybody that's watching this to at least give it a read, because you've shot down the big argument, It's not
that's
real.
That's an idea.
Yeah.
I'm in favor of reading the New Testament. Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion.
Yeah, it makes sense. You've lost your argument. Why not to do it? It's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah. Now we did an article, and I will put it in the link at the bottom of the page here. We mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier on, and we had Bart Ehrman at one of our conferences debating his Craig Evans, and Bart. I kind of like Bart Ehrman. He's a street fighter, so we're sort of a kindred spirit that way. And Bart doesn't feel like he has to fight fairly in his debates, and he doesn't. And Craig Evans is very much of a gentleman, and so he made some claims that were not exactly true, and Dr. Evans didn't really pick up on it. So I wrote an article. I wrote a 2-part article. One went into a scholarly journal, and one we printed, called "Interrupting Ehrman," dealing with the question of, are there contradictions in the Gospels? And I used the contradictions he gave to deal with that. And one of them happened to be this question about Mark, did he believe in resurrection? So I think for those who are interested, the article would be helpful. I will post the link to it in the description panel, so you can pick it up in about 30 minutes if you wanted to. So good.
And if you're interested in these topics, there's more information in the book, The Young Christian Survival Guide.
Right.
Plus bibliography that lets you pursue it into the primary sources and take it as far as you want to go.
Right. And there's also a link to that book in the description below. So you got that. And you have another book out, I see, Don. Description below.
I have a book coming out next month.
Coming out, right. Yeah.
Yeah, answers from Aslan, the enduring apologetics of C.S. Lewis, which is going to look at Lewis's apologetic and realize it's 80 years old. That was World War II when he was writing Mere Christianity, Miracles, The Problem of Pain. The world has changed a lot. The arguments are still good, but they might need another step or two in order to be able to connect with people today, because Lewis could make some assumptions about his audience when he was writing we can't necessarily still make about ours. The issues haven't changed, but the audience has changed.
Right.
And so the book is about how we need to factor that in as we learn from C.S. Lewis how to do apologetics, because he's the best role model we've got. Absolutely. So this book
TRWD8
is
says
about how
interesting.
Lewis can teach you to do your own apologetic in your own voice for your own audience. It should be out in about a month, I'm told.
Good. All right, any questions, comments, anybody else? Dinah in backstage, you have anything to say? All right, troops, we will see you all next week, 8 o'clock Central Time. Now we could do the, what was it on TV shows? We can all say our goodbyes.
Good night, John.
Live long.